When you think of Paris in the 1920s, you probably imagine the sparkling Eiffel Tower, wild jazz clubs, and fashionable flapper girls sipping champagne at midnight. And yes, all of that happened, but Paris also had a darker glow. Beneath the glitter, the city was quietly floating in a haze of heroin smoke. Yes, heroin. The drug that today sits in the absolutely do not touch category was once casually sprinkled into the nightlife scene like powdered sugar on a croissant. The First World War had ended, and Paris was eager to forget the trenches and the horror. Soldiers had marched home, many carrying physical injuries and emotional scars. Morphine was already common for pain relief, but chemists had a new toy heroin. It had originally been marketed in the late 1800s by Bayer. The aspirin people, yes really, as a safe alternative to morphine. Doctors thought it was less addictive. Spoiler alert, they were wrong. By the Roaring 1920s, heroin had slipped out of hospitals and into the hands of writers, musicians, and socialites. In Paris, it was easier to buy a little pouch of white powder than to get a decent baguette after midnight. The jazz clubs of Montmartre and Montparnasse weren't just filled with music, they were filled with people writing, euphoric waves that made their cigarette smoke swirl a little slower and their words slur a little softer. Heroin was chic. It wasn't seen as something that destroyed lives, it was glamorous, artistic, even intellectual. Writers and poets claimed it opened their minds. Jazz musicians claimed it gave them rhythm. Rich elites claimed it gave them something to do between martinis. And Paris, being the cultural capital of the world, became the perfect breeding ground for this new obsession. The atmosphere was intoxicating, glittering chandeliers, smoky jazz, women with bobbed hair and sequined dresses, men in sleek tuxedos and in the back rooms powder. The city's craving for heroin mirrored its craving for escape, pleasure, and forgetting the war. So yes, Paris was the city of light, but it was also, quietly, the city of white powder. When we think of Paris in the 1920s, images come to mind: smoky jazz clubs, the glittering chandeliers of the Folies Bergères, the daring flappers in their short skirts. But there's another side to this era, an often overlooked aspect that reveals a different kind of intoxication, a chemical adventure. This is the story of how 1920s Paris fell in love with a dangerous concoction of powders and potions, a trend that sounds like a recipe for disaster yet played out against the backdrop of one of history's most glamorous eras. After the First World War, soldiers returned home with visible and invisible wounds, suffering from traumas that doctors struggled to treat. Morphine and its chemical cousins became go-to solutions, readily prescribed to ease both pain and emotional scars. But as the war's devastation became less immediate, the need for these substances lingered. Doctors continued to prescribe them, often without fully understanding their effects. And this wasn't just happening in doctors' offices. Factories producing these chemicals found themselves with an excess of supply, a problem they ingeniously solved by marketing these substances for civilian use. Suddenly, these chemicals found their way into the hands of a wider population, all under the guise of everyday remedies. In the pharmacies of Paris, a city renowned for its chic and sophistication, these elixirs were sold as tonics, elixirs, powders, and tinctures. It was as easy to buy them as aspirin today. The regulations were lax, oversight minimal. What started in the doctor's cabinet seeped out into the streets, onto the café tables, and eventually onto the dance floors of Paris's famed nightclubs. Writers and poets, the cultural elite of the time, were among the first to experiment. Already known for their bohemian lifestyle, their habit of frequenting cafés, smoking exotic tobaccos, and seeking inspiration from the city's underbelly, they saw these new chemical concoctions as just another tool in their exploration of the human condition. It was as if absinthe and opium had been replaced by a new muse, one that promised a different kind of high, a different kind of art. In the smoky cafés of Montparnasse, you could find them huddled over tables, discussing the latest literary salons while discreetly passing around powders and potions. A young poet might confidently declare that modern science has given us new ways to think, all the while reveling in the chemical embrace that allowed him to do so. As the writers waxed poetic about their experiences, other patrons of the Parisian nightlife began to take notice. In the intimate setting of a jazz club or a clandestine cabaret, these chemical tonics became part of the allure. Hands that poured champagne or rolled cigarettes might also discreetly pass around powders and bottles, adding an extra layer of intrigue to the night's entertainment. People claim that these substances enhanced their experience of the music, helping them stay awake through long nights of dancing or simply making life feel more glamorous and surreal. The chemicals became part of the nightlife, a secret shared among those seeking to push the boundaries of their experience. For a time, Paris barely batted an eyelid at this cultural shift. Newspapers mentioned it casually in passing, noting the trend of young people experimenting with these new tonics. Gossip magazines sometimes described a famous painter or cabaret singer as indulging in white inspirations, a term that carried no sense of scandal, only a hint of admiration for those daring to live on the edge of convention. But this fascination wasn't confined to the dimly lit corners of Paris's nightlife. It trickled down to the grand boulevards, influencing fashion, art, and even advertising. Models on catwalks seemed to channel a newfound freedom, their movements echoing the intoxicating rhythm of the Charleston. Their clothes, loose-fitting and comfortable, allowed for uninhibited gestures for the body to move as it pleased. Art, too, reflected this chemical romance. Paintings took on a dreamlike quality, capturing the hazy atmosphere of a moonlit night in a smoky jazz club. The colors swirled and danced, mimicking the feeling of a heart racing under the influence. Even advertisements tapped into this trend, promoting a new perfume called La Nuit de l'Homme Usable. Its bottle shaped like a test tube promised a fragrance that was, quote, intoxicating and addictive. The very air of Paris seemed charged with a spirit of adventure, a willingness to experiment with the new, the unknown. The city was a canvas, a stage, a laboratory where the rules were made to be broken and where the night was always young. Today, we look back at this era and shake our heads at what we now recognize as a dangerous and reckless trend. But in the context of 1920s Paris, it was just another Tuesday night, a glamorous, intoxicating, and utterly mesmerizing chapter in the city's history. Paris in the 1920s is an iconic image, isn't it? Think of it, the birthplace of modern art, fashion, and design movements like Cubism, Dadaism, Surrealism, and Art Deco. It was also a hub for groundbreaking advancements in literature, film, and music. Oh, that music. When you think of 1920s Paris, does any genre spring to mind? Well, if you guessed jazz, you're right on the money. If the heartbeat of 1920s Paris was the café, then the pulse was surely the jazz club. After the First World War, jazz music arrived from across the Atlantic and electrified Paris. The French had never heard anything like it before. Its rhythms were unpredictable, its melodies wild, and its energy impossible to ignore. And in the crowded clubs of Montmartre, jazz found a home that was as chaotic and alive as the music itself. Montmartre was already a district of nightlife. The area had long been known for its cabarets like the famous Moulin Rouge and smoky dance halls that had entertained Parisians since the Belle Epoque. But in the 1920s, jazz transformed these spaces. Musicians from the United States, many of whom had come to Europe seeking opportunity and freedom from racial prejudice, became the stars of Paris. Audiences couldn't get enough. Trumpets blared, saxophones wailed, and dancers twirled until the early morning hours. And where there was music, there was culture mixing. The jazz clubs were places where everyone aristocrats, bohemians, artists, writers, and working-class Parisians could gather under the same roof. The atmosphere was intoxicating in more ways than one. Cigarette smoke filled the air, champagne glasses clinked, and in the dim light every note of music seemed to promise something daring and new. There are two things I love about this photograph. Firstly, the sheer energy of the music is palpable. Imagine being in that crowd, swept up in the moment, lost to the rhythm. It's exciting, isn't it? Secondly, take a close look at the instruments. Notice the trumpets and saxophones. They're not just objects here. They're extensions of the musicians' souls. Listen closely and you can almost hear the music echoing through the room. What a time to be alive. What an era. But let's not forget the backdrop of all this musical revolution. The city of Paris. Can you picture a young woman dancing the Charleston in a smoky jazz club with the Eiffel Tower twinkling in the background? Paris in the 1920s was a city of contrasts, of artistic brilliance and economic struggle, of traditional values and new freedoms. And it was in this melting pot of cultures and ideas that jazz found fertile ground to grow. For many, the music was more than just entertainment. It was a form of rebellion, a rejection of the old world order. In a society that was still recovering from the trauma of the First World War, jazz offered a chance to break free from the past and embrace the new. It was a call for liberation, a celebration of life in the face of death, a testament to the human spirit's resilience and its unyielding desire for joy. Writers and critics of the time often described jazz as dangerous or wild, and that was exactly why young Parisians loved it. Dancing to jazz felt like breaking the rules, especially for women who now had bobbed hair, short dresses, and an attitude of independence. The music seemed to mirror their new identity, bold, modern, and unwilling to be tied down. Montmartre became the epicenter of this cultural revolution. Its streets were filled with the sounds of laughter, music, and romance. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the scent of absinthe and cheap perfume. It was a place where anything seemed possible, where dreams were born and sometimes died, but always there was music. So when you picture Paris in the 1920s, imagine those jazz halls, smoke rising, trumpets blaring. People pressed shoulder to shoulder on the dance floor in a rhythm that seemed unstoppable. People came from all over Europe to experience the electric energy of Paris' jazz scene. They came to dance, to drink, and to lose themselves in the vibrant chaos of post-war Paris. Here they could momentarily forget the hardships of the outside world and immerse themselves in the timeless joys of music, movement, and making merry. There was a shared sense of abandon, a feeling that life was to be celebrated in spite of its ups and downs. And what better way to celebrate than with the infectious rhythms of jazz? So let the music play. Let the champagne flow and let the worries of the world fade away. Welcome to the Roaring Twenties. Welcome to Paris. If jazz was the music of Paris in the 1920s, then the flapper was its symbol. These women were bold, modern, and determined to live life on their own terms. Gone were the corsets and floor-length gowns of their mother's generation. Instead, flappers wore short dresses with sequins, feathers and fringe that sway as they danced the Charleston under the dim lights of Montmartre's clubs. The flapper's most shocking accessory was not her dress, but her attitude. She smoked cigarettes in public, drank cocktails late into the night, and danced with as much confidence as any man. In a city where tradition once ruled, the sight of a young woman with bobbed hair, a daring hemline, and a carefree laugh was enough to make older generations clutch their pearls. But to the youth of Paris, this was freedom. Nightclubs catered to this new wave of independence. Women no longer waited for men to lead them to the dance floor. They went themselves. They stayed out until dawn, filled smoky halls with laughter, and declared with every movement that they were no longer bound by the rigid rules of the past. In the same cafés and clubs where famous writers scribbled notes and jazz musicians played until sunrise, flappers claimed space of their own. Of course, the flapper image was not just about rebellion. It was also about glamour. Paris fashion houses embraced the new look, and soon women across the city were imitating the style. Shorter skirts, lighter fabrics, and hairstyles that took hours to perfect despite looking effortlessly casual. The Garcon look, the boyish silhouette, was chic and daring, capturing the spirit of the age. But behind the sequins and feathers, the flapper also represented a deeper cultural shift. These women had seen war take brothers, fathers, and husbands. They had worked in factories during the conflict, and now, in peacetime, they were unwilling to retreat quietly into the background. Dancing until sunrise wasn't just fun, it was a statement. Think of the iconic image of the 1920s flapper, a symbol of an era that continues to fascinate us today. What comes to mind? A woman with a dropped-waist dress, a feather boa around her neck, and a cigarette dangling from her red lipstick-stained lips. Her hair is bobbed, and she has a mischievous glint in her eyes. She is the epitome of the jazz age, a time when music, art, and literature exploded with creativity and the world was recovering from the trauma of the First World War. But have you ever wondered why the flapper became such an enduring symbol of the 1920s? Why does her image continue to capture our imagination almost a century later? The flapper emerged in the United States after the First World War and quickly became a cultural icon of the Roaring Twenties. She represented a new kind of woman, one who was independent, stylish, and unapologetically herself. She rejected the constraints of the Victorian era and embraced a more carefree lifestyle. This was a time when women were breaking barriers and achieving what was previously thought impossible. They were getting degrees, working in traditionally male-dominated fields, and of course dancing the Charleston and smoky jazz clubs. The flapper was not just a product of her time. She was a driving force behind the social and cultural changes of the 1920s. She was a symbol of female empowerment and the changing role of women in society. And while the 1920s were a time of great prosperity and economic growth, they were also a time of significant challenges and change. The war had taken millions of lives and left many countries in ruins. People were struggling to rebuild their lives and find a new sense of normalcy. In this context, the flapper emerged as a beacon of hope and optimism. She represented a rejection of the old ways of doing things and a celebration of the possibilities that lay ahead. But what made the flapper so appealing? What was it about this new kind of woman that captured the imagination of the world? Perhaps it was her confidence, her independence, and her willingness to break the rules. Or maybe it was her style, her sense of humor, and her ability to dance the night away. Whatever it was, the flapper became a cultural icon and a symbol of the 1920s. Today, we continue to be fascinated by the flapper because she represents a time of great change and transformation. She was a trailblazer who paved the way for future generations of women. And while the 1920s may be long gone, the spirit of the flapper lives on in the hearts and minds of those who admire her courage, her independence, and her style. Paris in the 1920s wasn't just about jazz clubs and glittering flappers, it was also about words. Writers from around the world flocked to the city, and for good reason. Paris was cheap, vibrant, and overflowing with inspiration. Cafés in Montparnasse and the left bank became their offices, where they could sit for hours with a single cup of coffee, scribbling furiously into notebooks. This was the era of the lost generation. Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Gertrude Stein, James Joyce, and countless others all found themselves in Paris at one point or another. They were searching for meaning after the devastation of World War I, and they poured their restless energy into novels, poems, and essays. In smoky cafés, you might have seen Hemingway arguing about boxing, or Fitzgerald laughing too loudly after a late night out, or Joyce scribbling cryptic notes for Ulysses. But it wasn't just American expatriates who shaped the literary scene. French writers, too, embraced the spirit of the decade. Jean Cocteau, André Breton, and the Surrealists were busy inventing new ways to write, challenging everything people thought they knew about art and literature. Dreams, subconscious thoughts, and fragmented sentences spilled across pages as if grammar itself had gone out dancing in Montmartre. For these writers, Paris was more than a city, it was a laboratory. Every corner café, every smoky jazz hall, and every overheard conversation could spark a story. And like the flappers and musicians, the writers also experimented with how far they could push boundaries. They played with style, with form, and with ideas about freedom that would have shocked readers just a decade before. The energy of the city kept them going. Endless cups of coffee, late-night debates, and the lively atmosphere of the cafés gave them fuel to keep writing. And so, while the music played and the flappers danced, Paris's cafés echoed with the scratching of pens on paper. The 1920s literary scene remains legendary because it captured both the dazzling optimism and the quiet despair of the age. For every glass raised in celebration, there was a sentence written in search of meaning. Every party, no matter how dazzling, eventually begins to fade. By the late 1920s, Paris was still alive with music, fashion, and art. But the cracks in the glitter began to show. The decade that had started with so much energy and optimism was slowly becoming weighed down by its excesses. Nightclubs that had once seemed fresh and exciting now began to feel repetitive. Jazz still echoed through Montmartre, but the novelty of it was no longer quite so shocking. The same cafés where writers and painters had once debated ideas, were now filled with familiar faces repeating the same arguments. For a city built on change and reinvention, even the wild freedom of the 1920s began to feel ordinary. There was also a darker reality behind the glamour. Some artists and performers who had been celebrated in the early part of the decade found themselves exhausted, burned out, or simply forgotten by audiences who had moved on to the next trend. For every dazzling success story, there were countless others whose names disappeared from memory, leaving behind only faint traces in old newspaper clippings. Economically, too, storm clouds gathered. While Paris continued to party, the world around it was shifting. The financial crash of 1929 would soon send shockwaves across the globe, and the cheerful optimism of the 1920s would give way to a far harsher reality. For those who had built their lives on the endless celebration, the coming years would be a sobering reminder that nothing lasts forever. And yet, even in this downward spiral, Paris retained its strange magic. The lights still glowed on the boulevards, music still spilled into the streets, and the cafés still filled with chatter. But beneath the surface, a generation that had danced to forget the war now faced a new uncertainty that no amount of champagne or jazz could wash away. Paris in the 1920s wasn't just a city, it was a stage. The writers who gathered there weren't only recording the world around them, they were reshaping it. Their words carried the weight of a generation trying to rebuild after the chaos of war. And in smoky cafés, cramped apartments, and endless nights, they forged literature that would outlive them all. The lost generation may have been restless, reckless, and uncertain, but their stories gave voice to the confusion and beauty of their time. And perhaps that's why Paris in the 1920s still fascinates us. It reminds us that out of disillusionment can come brilliance, and that even in the midst of despair, creativity has the power to endure. So when we look back at that era, at Hemingway's terse sentences, Joyce's tangled experiments, or Fitzgerald's glittering despair, we aren't just reading books. We're hearing the heartbeat of a city that became a sanctuary for dreamers, misfits, and storytellers. Paris gave them a stage, and in return they gave us timeless words. And that is why, nearly a century later, the legend of literary Paris still lingers like cigarette smoke in a Montparnasse café.